government is not doing anything, so we're going to have to step in with our green products. That's actually what Larry writes in his 2018 letter, January 2018. This is right when I started. His line was fascinating. He said that, and I kind of believed it at the time because I just started. He said, "Oh, government's failing, so we need to step in. The private sector needs to step in." Then I actually spent time working there, and I realized what we were doing had no impact unless government changes incentives. Right.
Thank you. On other articles, you have insisted that the government should approve carbon tax, for example, rather than putting the belief on the market or ESG investment. Could you tell us more about your view on what the market can do and the government should do?
Yeah, so it's an important point when I say that I think that the government has to lead. I don't think that the government is going to do all the work. Right? So it's not that I think that the government doesn't have the money to do all of it. And B, anyway, you don't want the government like building electric cars and stuff like that. They're not going to be very good at it. So when I say that, I'll say the government has to lead. My view is that the private sector and markets have to do most of the work to get us to the climate transition, right? It's most of the jobs and most of the capital in the economy, right? And most of the money is going through financial markets. So that has to be the core part of our solution. But my concern is that the markets don't operate all by themselves. You can't just sit and wish for them to. You really need to think about government and the special powers it has to change incentives. Because governments, first of all, they have the systemic powers. So I use in the paper the analogy of flattening the COVID curve. And I say that, when you're flattening the infection curve, it's a systemic curve that science tells us we need to flatten. We all contribute to it, and then we all are affected by it. So it's really everybody. And for that, that you have to get governments to step in and close the bars, right? Because if you leave the bars open, people tend not to be that responsible when they have a few drinks, right? To keep you safe, they have to close this. Unfortunately, I have to close schools, right? And that's terrible because, Rumie does work in education, so you see the negative impact over time. But the government has to lead because it has the systemic powers to flatten the curve and change behavior as fast as we need it done. And it also, this is important, has a democratic legitimacy to do those things, right? Because we've elected them. With the emissions curve, we don't, it's the same idea, right? The experts say that you need a series of actions led by government, including a carbon tax, industry by industry standards, right? So for buildings, it's energy efficiency. For automotives, it's vehicle emissions limits. And if you give those guidelines, you say, for example, only electric cars from 2030 or 2025, it'll cost car companies more money today to invest, but they will make it, right? They'll make that. If they're told they have to, they'll figure it out. If you're told you can't have coal, you'll figure out, the alternative. But the problem I see is that people don't want to use the levers of government action because particularly in the US, this is what worries me around. I'm a Canadian, but I've spent, half my life in the US and I studied in the US. And I also lived into grad school in Europe. And my concern is that in New York in particular, the consensus on how Wall Street views the markets is that they are reflexively anti-taxes and regulation on everything. So you get the leaders who sign the Business Roundtable statement, they actually go out there and they'll say, well, the government is not doing anything, so we're going to have to step in with our green products. That's actually what Larry writes in his 2018 letter, January 2018. This is right when I started. His line was fascinating. He said that, and I kind of believed it at the time because I just started. He said, "Oh, government's failing, so we need to step in. The private sector needs to step in." Then I actually spent time working there, and I realized what we were doing had no impact unless government changes incentives, right? Which I liken in the paper to, an athlete changing or the referees changing the incentives by penalizing dirty play, and I realized that. That not only are the business leaders today, many of them, again, particularly in the U.S., they're saying, no, the government's not doing anything, so I have to step in. And then you start looking and you realize that behind the scenes, they're actually lobbying through directly and indirectly through the Chamber of Commerce, through the Business Roundtable, through all these industries, the lobbying against climate legislation. They're pressing politicians to delay it. They're marketing to the world that, you know, they'll do everything on their own because they care about stakeholders and all. You know, if you liken it to the sports analogy, it would be like the players saying, oh, you know, you have to rely on self-refereeing, right, and good sportsmanship. And then you realize that, like, it's one thing if, you know, you and I are playing the Sunday soccer league at the park and there's no referee and we have to play clean and referee ourselves. But this is like a professional game, and there's referees like standing over there, and they're actually paying the referees. They're saying, oh, the referees aren't doing their job, so you have to rely on us. And then you realize they're paying the referees to not do their job. They're marketing to the world with billions of dollars that you don't need referees to, you know, do work. And so it's quite disconcerting because you realize that there's a certain level of almost sort of a hypocrisy there, right? That they're sort of saying, well, the government's not doing their job, and then they're actively trying to prevent the government from doing their job. So all of which is to say that I think government plays a critical role. It's not going to do everything, right? Sometimes people misinterpret, and someone says, I'm a capitalist. No, I'm a capitalist too. I'm a former investment banker. I just think capitalism needs rules, because unless you set incentives correctly, you tend to see that the environment gets destroyed because nobody values it. And, you know, those sort of changes they have to come through democratic processes and through the special powers of government. The most important data point that we should look at and think about is in the last 5 years, every year, talk about ESG has increased, right? ESG assets have increased massively, right? We're seeing that. And what's also increased has been carbon emissions and, you know, inequality and all the things that they're actually meant to do something about. There's no connection between them, right? And this is my concern